Okay, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for making the time to come along. I'd first like to acknowledge that I am on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country and want to acknowledge that they're them as the traditional owners of this land and thank them for looking after this beautiful space that we have in Banyule. I think that we might have a few people from different country around. So if you wanted to put your own acknowledgement in the chat, please go ahead and do that. So this workshop is a part of our home harvest series. And so some of you might have noticed that our annual home harvest picnic is not going ahead in 2021. And we had to make that decision quite a few months ago in 2020. And with the uncertainty around the COVID restrictions, we thought it was best to make that decision early. So instead, what we decided we would do is try and create something permanent and ongoing for both Banyule and Nillumbik that had that same theme. And so we put out a tender for local artists to help us create 8 seed libraries that will be housed at the Hurstbridge Hub and the Yarra Plenty Regional Library locations in Nillumbik and Banyule, as well as Shop 48 in Heidelberg West. And they're being made at the moment, and they're going to be a permanent fixture at those locations from the start of March. And so for the next couple of weeks, we're going to do a couple of workshops about seed saving and general vegetable gardening along the lines that we do normally with home harvest. But then we'll also have some sort of launch event around the start of March. So look out for that, and you can keep up with what's going on by signing up to the Local Food Connect newsletter, the Banyule Green Wrap, or the Nillumbik e-news as well. And so we can put some of those links in the chat for you. So thank you very much for making some time tonight, and I'll hand over to Kat to take us through this one.
Thank you so much, Ellie, and thank you to Banyule and Nillumbik councils for sponsoring this session. I want to welcome you all here and also acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri land tonight, where I live in Northcote. There's a huge effort now around promoting the spreading and sharing of Indigenous food plants through seed. So I'm going to drop in a couple tonight, the Murnong or yam daisy, and also talk about some native grasses, which are being experimented with to put into foods in the way that they have been traditionally prepared as bread by Indigenous people for many thousands of years. I just want to acknowledge the sovereignty of Indigenous people and the need for constitutional recognition and a treaty process as well. So we're talking about seed saving tonight, and I have a couple of goals for the session. I'm really hoping they line up with your goals. My goals are to give you a solid introduction to seed saving, and the session is broken into 3 parts tonight. The first is a little bit around the why of seed saving. Then we're going to go into a bit of theory, which I try and really hold back on jargon, but some theory and jargon is a little bit important, I feel, to then understand what's going on when we get into some of the techniques, which is the practical part of the session and where we'll hopefully spend most time. I'm going to give you techniques for 9 common vegetable plant families tonight. And my goal for the end of the session is for you to know where to start, and also have some resources, of course, if you want to take your knowledge further and learn more in this area. So I don't like to just give straight lectures, and I want to encourage you to ask questions throughout the session if you'd like to do that. Probably the best way to do that is using the chat window, but if it's uncomfortable for you to type and listen at the same time, then Zoom has a feature, for those who know it, where you can add a reaction, and in the reactions there's a raise hand option. So I'll do my best to scan. I apologise in advance if I miss you and you've got your virtual hand up, and hopefully Ellie and Steph can help me if they see a hand up that I haven't got to yet. But I will pause at strategic points to make sure that we're on track and check that if there's any questions before we move on. Anything we don't get to, I'm happy to cover at the end of the session, and I'm happy to stay until there's no more questions when we finish up. So I won't let you go tonight with a burning question, but it may not always come at exactly the same point that you ask it. I also want to encourage you to be quite bold with questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. I try and pitch my sessions at the beginner level so that we don't leave anyone behind. So if you've got a question, I encourage you to ask it, because there's probably 20 more people that would like to know the answer to that. But at the same time, I just want to acknowledge there's probably people with years, decades even, of experience in seed saving on the call tonight. So you're a real asset to us, and I would love you to put some of that experience in the chat window as well. I'd also like you to disagree with me, and I learn a lot from people saying, oh, that's actually not something I found. So do feel free to pop that kind of thing as well into the chat window so that we can all learn from your experience. I'm, as you know, recording the session. I just wanted to note that if you ask a question and you speak using your microphone, you will appear in that video recording. So just want to let you know for privacy reasons that that's the case. And if you don't want to appear in the video recording, just pop that question in the chat window for me so we can get to it there. And another note on privacy is you can actually change the name that's displayed publicly by finding your name in the participants window and then clicking on the name and clicking rename. So if that applies to anyone, you can do that now. Okay, and I've got some notes for you. So I will be sharing them after the session. And in fact, I know some people really love to have them before the session. So if you bear with me for 1 minute, I will find them for you. And here they are now, Ashley. So they're just going to appear in the chat window for you for anyone who'd like to follow through. And I will send them to Nilambik and Banyul to distribute if you don't want to download them now. So that's my plan. I hope it feels like a worthwhile use of the next 2 hours for you. And on that note, I'm going to jump into some slides where I can share with you some photos and some videos as well. So we're going to start by talking about, of course, seed saving and just some of the, I guess, the magic that I'd love to try and share with you of these precious things that we call seeds. And the more that I start learning, reading about seeds, just the more phenomenal and incredible they appear. So the humble, simple dandelion that we all walk past probably every day has evolved to give its seeds aerial capability so they can spread a long way on the wind. And we have seeds that are designed to be picked up and carried in another way by animals, that are brightly coloured or that are wrapped in a beautiful, sweet, nutritious package, otherwise known as a fruit, that are designed to be eaten by animals like you and I, and then carried some distance and hopefully, the plant hopes, deposited somewhere in a package of fertiliser ready to start a new generation. Then we have seeds that have the opposite strategy, that are often small and brown, and they're designed to camouflage on the ground and not to be eaten because they might not make it through a digestive system. We have, of course, Australian native seeds that have to go through some kind of fire event in order to germinate. So that fire scarifies the seed and treats it so that the seed knows to germinate. And of course, it's very advantageous for these plants to know when there will be light, when some of the canopy has been burnt out. So they'll have light resources, and they'll have a bed of ash, which is full of minerals, as a fertility boost to help them on their way. We have other seeds with a chemical coating that has to be washed off by rain before they'll germinate. So these clever little seeds, they won't just germinate in any weather. They wait until the rains have arrived and then they go. So it's almost like the more you look, the more special adaptations there are. So seeds are a very special little package. If we were in a room together tonight, I would be handing you all out some large bean seeds that have been soaked overnight. And I'd be asking you to try and split the two halves and tell me what you could see. I'm hoping you'll imagine doing this. And some of you with good dexterous fingers would split them open and you'd have something like the picture in front of you to look at. And what I'm hoping you can see here is a little leaf, or in fact 2 leaves, and a root as well. And so I wanted to show you this because every seed, doesn't matter how large or small, does have something like this inside it. And I came across a quote, and I wish that I could tell you where it was from, but I've long lost that, but I just love the quote. And that is that a seed is a baby plant asleep with its lunch. That's what you're looking at in front of you now. And so to highlight that for you, what we've got is the embryonic plant, which is the root and the leaves that I'm going to outline for you with my mouse, if you can see it. And then we have the seed coat, which is often brightly coloured, sometimes not, that you can't see in this split seed. And then, of course, we have the food store. And this is the packed lunch for the baby plant that's going to supply it with enough energy to put its roots down and get its leaves up until it can create its own solar power through the leaves, and then away it goes. So I wanted to show you this little diagram as well. Don't get caught up on any of the words here, but just to have a picture of how the seed develops over time. The other thing that might be interesting for people who are starting to garden in this little diagram is just noting with that final seedling image that you've actually got some funny looking leaves, and then you've got this, what we call the true leaves, that start to look more like a bean leaf. So the funny looking leaves actually come from inside the seed, and they are the food store, and they sort of gradually wither away as they're used, and then we get from then on the proper bean-like leaves. So that's a tiny little bit of anatomy on what we're looking at with seeds. And of course, the implication here is that a seed, even though it looks inert, a seed is very much a living thing, and it's an essential part of the life cycle of many plants. And we need to treat it as such as gardeners if we want it to grow and thrive when we plant it. So at the end of the session, we'll be looking at ways that we need to store seeds to ensure their continued viability and extend that for as long as possible. And we'll loop back and just remind ourselves of this when we get to that stage. Okay, I want to ask why you would bother saving your own seeds. And clearly all of you out there will have hopefully at least one reason, because you've committed to the session tonight. So pop in the chat window for me, what are your personal reasons for saving seeds? And while you're doing that, I've got an image here of one of the reasons that people often mention to me, which is just how much more cost effective it is. And I have a packet of dill seeds on the right, of course, from a wonderful, reputable heirloom seed supplier. And I have on the left-hand side one season's worth of dill seeds from only a small number of plants. You just look at that and see how many more seeds you can generate as a home gardener. So many that you'll never be able to plant them all yourself. And I guess that's one of the lovely things. You will almost always have surplus seeds to share. And hopefully you can hook into some of the seed libraries that are now being set up around Melbourne to distribute those to some other gardeners. I've got lots of comments in the chat window here. We've got seeds, creating a seed bank from Natasha to base on non-commercial common seeds, fantastic. Seeds to share from Meg. We've got reproducing plants that you love from Susan. We've got seeds adapted to the local environment. That's great, Makoto. We'll come to that in a second. The best producing plants, so we get really strong seeds from Sal, and so on and so on. So there's a lot in there. Challenge Monsanto, yes. so Monsanto is one of the corporate giants that have a huge role in our food system. I'm not going to get super political tonight, but I do want to talk a bit about the way that our food is conventionally produced. And this image, although it's not very high quality, it really says a lot to me. And this is an image of commercial scale tomato production. And no doubt anyone who's grown a tomato out there listening knows that you don't pick it when it's green, and you certainly don't throw it into the back of a vehicle by the bucket load. Imagine how much pressure the tomatoes at the bottom of that pile are under. And so, of course, if you want to transport your tomatoes a long way, you need to pick them at this stage, otherwise they won't survive that journey and you'll never make a profit. And when they get to that shelf, they need to look to the consumer as perfect as possible so that they'll choose them off the shelf. And unfortunately, that is at the expense of flavour quite often. And as gardeners know, the most tasty varieties are often not the ones that look like a picture perfect cliched tomato. So on the right hand side, we've got some of the heirloom varieties that have been saved and handed down from farmer to gardener to farmer over many hundreds of years. The ones in the top are a lovely one at a farmer's market. The ones at the bottom are some of my favourite cherries, the black cherry and the red fig that I grow a lot of in my garden. Now, what I find amazing about tomatoes in particular is that the very first tomatoes were about 1 centimetre wide and yellow. I've got a little image of one, almost actual size probably, in the centre of your screen there. And these grow on the Galapagos Islands and places around there. And it's this genetic stock that all of the tomatoes that we can see, all this incredible variety has been bred from. So a long time ago, people ate some of these fruits and then decided they liked them. And over the years, people selected ones that started to have a blush of red, and we ended up with red tomatoes or purple tomatoes or stripy green tomatoes or dark, almost black tomatoes. And they selected for different shapes, like a plum shape or a teardrop shape, or a kind of lobed beefsteak variety. And they selected for different consistencies. So we've got tomatoes that are made for paste and for sauce making that are quite fleshy. And we have really beautiful melting, juicy salad tomatoes and everything in between. So what I'm saying here is that from this one plant's genetics, we have, as gardeners and farmers, expanded to breed this phenomenal range of thousands of heirloom tomato varieties. And that diversity is very precious. I'm going to come to that in just a minute. Some of you mentioned that you like saving your own seeds because they're stronger and also locally adapted to your conditions. So the image here is showing you what strong seed looks like. On the right-hand side, you can see some home-saved beetroot seed. On the left-hand side, you can see some beetroot seed that was out of a packet that was a bit old and maybe hadn't been stored very well. And so if you look at the difference there, it's pretty clear that strong seed is an advantage for you as a food gardener. Fresh seed literally bursts into life, and it's going to create stronger plants and also most likely a much better crop as well. And as Mikoto mentioned, you can over time locally adapt seeds to your conditions if you save them over a number of generations, probably at least 7, which we'll come to later on as well. Now, that diversity that I was talking about, a huge reason why I save seeds is about preserving agricultural biodiversity, which there is a bit of overlap, but there's a lot of people focusing on Indigenous plant biodiversity, which is hugely important, critical, in fact. There are also food plants whose biodiversity is significant to us as a species. And of course, there are Indigenous food plants as well that cross the lines between the two. And there are some phenomenal stories that I can share with you of people have really fought to maintain this diversity over time. And one that I find particularly moving is the photo on the left, which is the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. Can't tell you much about the politics around that time, but I do know that inside this city, which was under siege, there was a seed bank, and there were Russian botanists who were holed up in that seed bank. And everybody around them was starving. People died from starvation. And inside the seed bank, surrounded by bags of grain crops that were food, but were also seed, some of these Russian botanists starved to death when they could have eaten that seed, but they understood the significance of what they were protecting and storing. And they made that sacrifice so that we could have the diversity that we do today. On the right-hand side, there's another very moving story from Syria. And of course, we all know Syria has been through some really tough times lately with the war. And Syria was the home to a significant dryland food seed bank. And this contained lots of varieties of chickpeas, for example, and other grain crops that are suited to dry climates. And the brave people running that seed bank stayed push until they could get those precious seeds across the border to safety. So those seeds have now survived, and that seed bank has been moved to outside of the country. But these people really understand the significance of what they're doing. And I feel the least we can do as gardeners and farmers is to help and do our bit to preserve this diversity as well. And seed banks, of course, are important, but they're not the end of the story, because seed is a living thing and it needs to be continually saved and grown out and then saved again. And if we want seeds that are locally adapted to us in Melbourne, then we need to save and grow them in Melbourne so they stay adapted to our climates. So for me, seed saving is about protecting our heritage and also securing our future, because the climate change that is happening will mean that we probably want slightly different varieties of many crops in the future. And this is the palette, I guess, that we have to choose from. So if we lose the diversity that's out there in all of these crops, we won't have as many options to choose from when we need to adapt to a different range of season temperatures and so on, different rainfall, maybe different pests arriving as well. So with that aside, I want to now go into some more of the detail around seeds. And I thought it would be good to put in here a quick note about what we don't usually grow from seed for people getting started gardening. Now, you can have seed from potatoes and garlic and shallots, but usually people grow them from a piece of the parent plant. It's often called seed when you buy it, which is quite confusing, but what you'll be buying is a garlic bulb or what's called a seed potato that you can cut up and plant, and so on. So they're not true seeds in the sense that there's no sexual reproduction. You're actually growing something that is genetically identical to the parent, because it's continuing to grow the same tissue that was taken from a parent plant. Also, many fruit trees are not grown from seed. We often grow them from a cutting, so a piece of the parent plant. And that's so we know exactly what type of fruit we're going to get. We don't have any mixing up of varieties in pollination processes. And perennial herbs, things like oregano and thyme and rosemary and sage, and quite a long list in there, can be grown from seed, but it's often so much easier to grow them by dividing a clump of herbs in someone else's patch that usually home gardeners won't bother. So a little footnote in here around things maybe not to bother with, and I'll go through some of the ones which are easy and good for home gardeners soon. Okay, I will just pause there and check with Ellie and Steph if there were any questions that I missed, or if any of that was unclear, pop a question in the chat window for me.
No, a bit of chat coming through, but no questions at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. In that case, we'll launch into some seed terminology. And again, this is the very minimum that I feel is necessary in order for you to come out with a good solid base of understanding at the end. So bear with me. If you don't want to latch onto any of these terms, you can still save great seeds. So we'll just take a couple of minutes here and then we'll get on to the practical techniques. So firstly, hybrid seeds. You often hear about, and it has a bit of a bad reputation. A hybrid seed is a cross between two varieties of the same species, which has some characteristics from each of those. And we'll go through an example in a minute, but hybrid seed is what we call genetically unstable. So future generations, so as in you saving the seed and planting it, may not resemble the parents. Hold on to that one for a second. I'll give you a contrast and then we'll look at an example. Open pollinated seeds are former hybrid crosses that have been genetically stabilized over time so that future generations are going to resemble the parents as long as we control the pollination and don't mix it with other plants of the same variety. So it's a lot to get your head around, and I think it's best to explain through an example. But it goes without saying the open pollinated seeds are the ones that I'm going to encourage you to save the most, and I'll talk about why in a minute. I can see Sylvia's made a comment that probably explains my unusual looking pumpkins this year. Bingo, Sylvia. It's quite likely. So let's have a look at an example and see how this pans out in practice. This is a packet of sweet corn seeds from my collection. And I know that this is a hybrid seed because it has these letters F1, letter and number, I should say. F1 signifies that this is a hybrid seed, and it may have no other writing on it. So if you want to know if it's a hybrid, just look for this F1 on your seed packets. Now, what happens when we grow this seed? Let's imagine, first of all, that we've got some parent varieties. And in fact, I'm just going to go to tomatoes because they're just a simpler example for us all. And I want to imagine that we have parent 1, which is one of those really tough tomatoes that withstands being thrown into the back of a ute when they're picked green and then transported, maybe stored for a couple of weeks, transported a long distance over bumpy roads. So we'll call that our parent 1 tomato. And that's got all those tough characteristics that are good for commercial supply chains. Then we've got a parent 2, and this is your show-stopping, gorgeous beauty of a tomato that is glossy and red and round and shiny. It just looks everything like a textbook tomato that we've been led to believe. Now, these two parents, if we cross them together, which usually, it's happening through a paintbrush often if you're doing this deliberately, or it can happen through insects and wind naturally. So we're transferring pollen from one of the parents to the female parts of the second parent flower. And then we create, we gather some seed from the fruit that forms, and we get the F1 hybrid seed. Now, when we plant that seed, great. So we get the beautiful, strong characteristics of parent 1, and we get the gorgeous, beautiful looks of the parent 2. But when we try to save the seed from our hybrid tomato that we've grown, we end up with some really interesting things going on. So in the first generation, we might get a mix of parent 1 and parent 2, some F1 lookalikes, and then we might get some other random things happening as well. So it's a complete mixed bag. If we do a process that we call roguing, where we don't save seed from any of the ones except the hybrid ones that we want, and then we grow that on, we might get a bit more variability and maybe a little bit more of the hybrid variety. And if we save seed just from the ones that look right and taste right and feel right to us, then we keep growing that on. What will eventually happen at some point is we'll end up with a generation where everything looks like that hybrid variety that we're targeting. So obviously the amount of time this takes is going to depend on the variety. What I have read is that it probably takes at least 7 generations for most common seeds. And at this stage where we're getting a stable form, we call this a genetically stable variety, and it's considered to be then an open pollinated variety that will have consistent crops. So I guess the message here is there's nothing inherently wrong with hybrid seeds. And this is a process that backyard breeders and small farmers have gone through for hundreds of years, if not thousands. The issue here, and where hybrid seeds can get a bit of a bad reputation, is when they start displacing open pollinated and local varieties on a very wide scale. So the stats of how much hybrid seed is in our food system is staggering. And I guess for every hybrid tomato that we eat, we stand the risk of losing some of our local and open pollinated varieties. So that's why I'm going to encourage you to lean heavily towards open pollinated, but know that it's okay to have a couple of hybrid seed packets, I feel. We all draw our own ethical lines, but just know exactly what you're buying into in that sense. And the other issue here, mostly from a farmer's perspective, is that not being able to save your own seeds is a real added expense and cost, and puts you back in the hands of a company, so it makes you a bit more dependent on that system. So I hope that helps understand hybrids. If there are questions related to them, pop those in the chat window and we can check in with them before we move on too much further. There's a bit more seed terminology that I'd like to go through with you. And another one is genetically modified seeds. These, of course, also have a very bad reputation. I'm not going to go into all the politics around it tonight, but I wanted to make the clear distinction that these are not the same as hybrid seeds. What we're talking about with GM seeds are genes that have been added from another plant or even another animal and inserted by scientists in a lab context to create genetically modified seeds. So that's not what we're talking about with hybrid seeds, as you can see. I've just got a little bit of background noise. I'm just going to mute the person. Sorry about that. Okay, and then the next one, of course, is heirloom seeds, and they don't always have such a clear definition, shall we say. So my definition of an heirloom seed is an old, locally valuable variety of a plant that has been passed down between generations of farmers and gardeners. Heirloom seeds are, by definition, open pollinated, non-patented and not hybrid seeds. We do sometimes hear people talk about modern heirlooms that have been quite recently bred using that process I just described, and then are shared usually outside a commercial system, but not always. So it's not as clear-cut a category, but it's important to understand the spirit behind heirloom seeds, if you will. And then we also have organic seeds as well. And organic certified seeds are more about the way that they've been grown, less about the history of the seed itself. So they've been produced according to some standards, organic standards, and they're grown without synthetic chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. So those organic seeds often will be open pollinated, but it's not necessarily the case. I'm actually not sure what the certification says, but you could, in theory, grow hybrid seeds using organic methods, for example, even if they weren't necessarily certified. So I hope that clears up some of the confusion that's out there around these labels. And the last bit of jargon we're going to go into is around the pollination process. Now, a little pop quiz question for you here. I want you to have a look at the photos in this picture down the bottom left and right and see if you can tell me which one was pollinated by insects and which one is pollinated by wind, and how can you tell? So if you think you've got an answer for that, pop it in the chat window for me and we'll come back to that in a minute. At its most simple description, pollination is about moving pollen grains, so from the male parts of one flower to the female parts of a flower. And where it gets interesting in nature is that we can actually have male and female parts contained in the same flower, or we might have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. Or in some cases, we have separate male and female plants. So you can have all of those different combinations depending on the species that we're talking about. And as a seed saver, it is helpful to know which one you're dealing with. Because, for example, if you only have a female kiwi fruit vine, then you're unlikely to end up with any fruit on it, for example. And just knowing the basics of how this pollination process works can help us to really understand what's going on and to troubleshoot down the track as well. As you can see in the diagram, bees are a common pollinator, and I couldn't help but share with you this lovely image here of a bee just totally encased in pollen. And I love watching them rummage around in a zucchini flower and then come out almost blinded by the pollen and sit there on a leaf in the sun and have to comb the pollen off themselves and comb it into their little baskets to take back to the hive. And you can see the little baskets just here in the diagram that they're carrying on their back legs. So you can look for that in the garden if you've never seen them do it. It's quite wonderful. Now, going to the chat window, we've got some very switched on people here, or some people that have made good guesses. And yes, so the general gist here is that the left-hand side, this is a native daisy brachycomb. These are pollinated by insects. And the right-hand side, this is a corn plant, they're pollinated by wind. And you don't necessarily need to know a lot about the plant to make a good guess here, because plants don't usually bother putting the effort into a showy flower if all they're trying to attract is some wind to blow that pollen around to the next plant. So the grass family, of which corn is a part, typically doesn't have any really showy flowers because they're wind pollinated. And so I hope that that's an interesting thing you can go out and look for in the garden as well. Beautiful. So lots of people got that right. Well done. Now, a bit more on pollination. I promise we're coming to the end of the terms here, and then we'll move on to some more practical stuff. So we need to understand the difference between a plant that is self-pollinated and a plant that is cross-pollinated, because different species of plant have different preferences. So with self-pollination, we often call them inbreeding plants, and it means that they don't need their pollen moved around very much. So it can be literally on the same flower, on the same plant, and only the tiniest little buzz of a bee's wings or a gentle breeze is enough to transfer that pollen and for pollination to occur. But by contrast, we have a group of plants that are called cross-pollinators that we also call outbreeding plants, and they require cross-pollination. So they must have a large, strong genetic base, and they require the genetics in more than one plant to maintain that pool that's going to help them stay strong into the future. So here we need to have some kind of vector, be that an insect or be that wind, to mix and move that pollen around. And often these plants will be incompatible with their own pollen, so they won't be able to pollinate themselves at all. Now, everyone's very familiar with bees, of course, but maybe I'll put a little note in here that lots of insects do pollination, including many flies, of course, lots of native bees as well. So that pollination can really happen from a wide range of species. And it's also important to note that you can, even on inbreeding plants, you can get some cross-pollination happening in there. And that's particularly likely in organic gardens where there's no sprays that are wiping out these pollinating insects, and where you tend to be growing a lot of varieties of the same species quite close together. So it's just not hard for an insect to mix that around. So bear in mind, you might get some even on a very self-pollinating plant. Now, with that genetic diversity that I've just spoken about, one of the slightly problematic things is that for plants that require it, we need to have a number of individual plants flowering at the same time to maintain that genetic diversity over the long haul. And that is particularly the case for some plants. So I'm going to give you the recommendations here from one of my best seed saving books for how many plants you need to save strong seed over a long term. And for silver beet, it's 6. You go, all right, maybe I have enough room for 6 silver beet plants. And for corn, depending on which book you read, people say 50 and up to 200 plants to maintain corn's pool of genetic diversity over time. Now I can feel a few hearts sinking out there, people who might like to save some seed from backyard corn. So I'm going to talk about how we, in fact, I might jump forward, excuse me for a minute. I'm going to talk about that for a minute. And the main message I wanted to convey here is don't let it put you off. Because in reality, I know very few gardeners who follow those recommendations, and I receive all the time fantastic seed from home gardeners that grows really strongly. So it's something that you shouldn't be limited by, but where I think it's helpful to understand this is if in their dying breaths, an older gardener hands you a small package of seeds that they've saved for their whole life and entrusts you to continue that variety forward for the next generation. So in that context, where you've got quite a precious and rare variety that may not be available again from a commercial source, it's really important to understand these things because you could be on a bit of a downhill trajectory. And you could find, for example, that as you try and save seed from small numbers of plants, the vigor goes down and the germination rate goes down. And you may start to lose some of the characteristics in, say, multicolored corn. You might have fewer and fewer colors appearing in that cob. So that's background noise again from the temperature.
No, what's happening?
That again. So that's what's at stake here, but I don't want it to put you off just saving seeds in a backyard, because we know that we can still do that and have some good results. So I'll jump backwards again, just to go through the pollination. So we're talking about the mixing that happens of pollination, sometimes by insects or by wind. And as you've probably gathered, and as Sylvia has gathered with her strange looking pumpkins, what can happen when we've got an insect or wind moving pollen around is we can start to get combinations of different varieties. So we might have the cross between a Jap pumpkin and a butternut, for example, appearing. So we get a jutternut or a BAP pumpkin, for example. So what we'd like to do as home gardeners, if we want to make sure that we continue to have a consistent variety, is try to control the way that pollination happens so we don't have a mixing between different varieties of the same species. Now, I've got some examples here of how we can do that. Some of these methods are just not very achievable for home gardeners in the city. And so, for example, the first two here is isolating different varieties by distance. So if you're out in the country, you could grow one type of pumpkins and you could grow another type of pumpkins, say, 5 or 10 kilometers away. And hopefully that's a bigger distance that you wouldn't have a bee traveling from one to the other, for example. The bees can actually go a lot further than that if they need to. So that's one technique, but of course that falls down in a small city block. And it falls down because your neighbours are probably also growing pumpkins, which is incidentally a good reason to share seed with your neighbours, because it can reduce the chances of it being a different variety over the fence. Another technique you could use is to just grow one variety at a time, or only allow them to flower at different times. But again, that falls down for similar reasons. We also have lots of wild relatives as well. As you can see in the photos here, I've got a photograph of some brassicas flowering at my place under a net. And then just around the corner in the park, I've got a weedy brassica variety here with almost exactly the same flowers. It's from the same species, and it could also be crossing with my crops at home. So really the most appropriate techniques on a small home garden scale are bagging up or taping flowers. And we're going to go through an example of how to tape flowers later in the session, or putting an insect screen cage over your plants during the pollination process. Keeping in mind though, that if there's no insect and it requires an insect, you'll have to be that insect. So dress up in your best bee costume and grab yourself a little paintbrush, and you'll have to go out there and transfer a bit of pollen around between flowers and plants in that family. So that's how we do controlled pollination. But look, once again, that doesn't usually happen in a garden context. So I'm mentioning it here for people that want to go on and maybe steward some rare varieties. I just want you to have an understanding of what might be happening if things don't go quite to plan in your own garden. Now, I think I'll pause there, just check again if there was any questions that came through from Ellie or Steph, if you're still with me.
Hello, no questions yet, but very impressed at everyone's knowledge from those plants before. Everyone got that right, I think.
Yeah, and I know there's some very experienced gardeners out there too. So once again, please keep popping your own tips and suggestions in that chat window as well as we go through. So the power of selection is also worth mentioning here. And so as we move into some of the practical techniques, I want to remind you that there is no such thing as saving seeds without also plant breeding. And that's a lovely paraphrased idea from Carol Deppy, who is the author of one of the books I'll share with you at the end. And what she's suggesting there is that every time we go out and grab seeds from a plant in our garden, we've made some decisions, whether or not they're deliberate, we have made decisions that are going to influence the next crop. So what it means is that you need to think like a plant breeder. And when you're selecting seeds, we want to select from plants that are strong and healthy and that we think are giving the best product, the best crop. So you might be selecting for a particular flavour that you love in your recipes, or you might be selecting for disease resistance because you've got a persistent problem in your garden. So what we do to select deliberately is we look for those strong plants or disease resistant plants or tasty plants, and we select seed from them only. And here you can see I've gone out and I've tied a marker around the broad bean pods that I'm intending to save for seed so that my partner doesn't accidentally go and grab them all for dinner one night. So that's a simple little trick that you can do at home. And the roguing is just what I mentioned earlier with the hybrid and open pollinated thing, where you just don't save seed, or you might sometimes even cut flowers off if you don't need them. Cut flowers off the plants that you're not intending so that you don't get their genetics mixing in with your chosen plants. And the expression that I love that my mum taught me a long time ago is keep the best and eat the rest. And that'll make sure that you have the best seeds imaginable. And it's worth remembering here that sometimes the best crops come quite early in the season. So don't wait until the last gasp of summer to organise your seed crops, or you might end up with some really weak seeds, unfortunately, for next year. And I've just seen in the chat window, there are a couple of questions that have come through. One of them is from Karen about only getting male zucchini flowers and how do I get a female one? I've got an image to show you what both of them look like if anyone doesn't have a picture already. The answer, Karen, is look, I'm not sure. I've had types of zucchini that never produced a female flower and I just had to rip them out and plant a different variety. So sometimes it just takes a while and they start off with one sex and then they start producing the other one. And it seems to sometimes happen worse in some years. So it could be a bit of a temperature or climate or weather thing as well. Let us know out there in the chat window if you've got experience with that one as well. It's certainly a problem I've had. And Angela's saying, just checking in, are you saying to only grow one variety? Not necessarily, Angela, but again, if you've got multiple varieties of the same species, like you've got one species of pumpkin, but there might be 3 different types, if you grow them all at once and you don't do anything to control pollination, then you may get a combination of those characteristics showing up in your next crop. So it's not necessarily a problem, but it's something to know if that concerns you, that you can do some things to control it. All right, so I think I'd like to move on now to those plant family groups. And just make sure that we get out of here with some techniques that you can start using. So that was the tricky and most complicated part of the session. And hopefully we can get into some more fun stuff now. Righto, so I'm going to go through family by family, and I'm going to start with what I think are the easiest, most accessible plants for beginners to save. And the number one for me would have to be the Fabaceae family or the bean family. Sometimes people call them legumes as well. And this, of course, includes your beans, broad beans, but also peas and snow peas as well. And the reason this family I think is so easy is that they are highly self-pollinating and apparently often pollinate the flower before it's even opened. So that means it's very unlikely you'll get lots of random crossing. And the way that we save a bean seed is just letting it mature long enough to fully form. And then we can just pick that pod off the plant and shell it, and we've got some seed. And having said that it's easy, there are a few little tricks that I want to share with you here just to make sure that you have success. So when I say you just pull a pod off the plant, the key thing, and we'll go through this with a few family groups, is you want to make sure that that pod is fully mature enough to have formed a well-sized and proper strong seed. So the image here that I've got of a pile of pods is showing the range that could be at. And have a look at the green ones here in the image. And I'd like you to imagine, I can't hold it up for you, but just imagine that I'm bending that pod and it's quite floppy. So it's not sort of rigid and crisp anymore. It's gone quite soft, and it feels like the seeds inside are almost separate from the green outer pod. And at that point, I can be pretty confident that that's ready for me to pick. If I'm unsure, which is fair enough as a beginner, you can wait and just let those pods almost like dry on the plant, like you can see here in the golden coloured pods. And that will be a sure thing. But just sometimes you might have, for example, a big rain event coming and you might not want to get them wet because then you've got to dry them quickly so they don't go mouldy. So sometimes I'll pick them at the green stage, but it's totally okay to leave them to dry on the plant and then pull them off. Now, when I've pulled them off, usually what I'll do is bring them inside in a basket, and I might actually shell some of the ones that are green, because if they've still got moisture in them, what can happen is the photograph on the bottom left here, where you can see I've actually opened a pod that's been sitting there in the pod for a while, and those precious bean seeds have actually started to sprout. And once they've started to sprout, you can't pause them, they can't repeat this step. So those seeds are kind of lost now. So we don't want that to happen, and we can encourage them to dry properly just by opening the pods up and shelling them out of the pod. Then what I'll do is leave them in a basket, and I tend to have at this time of year lots of beautiful baskets of seeds lying around the house, which just an aside are highly therapeutic to run your fingers through as you're contemplating deep problems. And I leave them here strategically so that they can really continue to dry. And I know that if I've left them out for, say, 4 weeks, that they will have completed the drying process if they're in a normal room temperature. So at that point, you could stash them away in your seed box. But I have one more trick for you, which is just that you can actually freeze seeds. And I find, where I am at least, it's very helpful to do this for the bean family, because there's a bean weevil beetle that can sometimes lay eggs inside these beans and then hatch them out in my seed box. Which is really sad. So what we can do is actually freeze them for about 3 days in a nice tightly sealed container or Ziploc plastic bag. And then once they've come back out again, they can go back into your seed box. Katrina also hates bean weevils. Yes, I don't hate them, but they're frustrating if they go through your seed box. And the key thing there is that, of course, they'll be very cold when they come out of your freezer, and cold things attract condensation. So we want to make sure that we don't open that package up until they're back at room temperature. Otherwise, all that drying gets reversed and they might go mouldy in storage. So a few little tricks in there, but that's a good one to know. And so far, I've frozen, I'd say, most common vegetable seeds, and they're still viable. And freezing seeds is actually a way that you can extend their lifespan as well, if you don't want to be buying seeds as regularly and you've just saved a large number. So if you have space in your freezer, you can actually save your whole vegetable seed collection in the freezer with quite good results. So there you go, a little trick in there. And the final photo on this slide is just showing you the range of seed that you will produce as a home gardener. And not all of it looks perfect. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to show you which seeds I'll plant and which ones I'll probably reject. You can probably work out which of the groups is which in there. So there is a bit of grading that I do with my own seed to make sure that I'm then planting only the strongest seed and hopefully having strong plants as well. Now, a couple of questions in there. We've got a bit of zucchini commentary, which is great. There's a comment around leeks, and they have a round seed ball. Yes, we're looking at them. And some baby leeks are being produced around the base of the main plant. Yes, so that can happen as well. We can have a vegetative reproduction where a bit of the mother plant's tissue grows on and becomes new plants. And we can also have seed production as well. So thanks for that contribution. We have a bit of chatter. My broadbean pods are black. Are they still viable? Broadbean pods will go black when they've dried out on the plant. So that's fine, and that's the equivalent of some of the dried out bean pods you can see in the image here. So they're most likely have still got good seed in them as long as it hasn't started to go mouldy. So go and open them up and make sure that that seed can dry properly. Okay, so that's our bean family. And I want to move along now to the Solanaceae family. And I don't mean to throw you off with these names, it just sometimes helps to just use them so that we can all become familiar with them together. This is the tomato family, and also sometimes called the Solanum family. And it includes tomatoes and capsicums and chilies and eggplants. And also for people who are interested, pepinos, which is a rather rare perennial melon variety that's quite good in temperate climates. And it also includes the kangaroo apple, which is a native plant, not really an edible plant, although there is some discussion about that. But if you're interested in native plants, you can also use this technique with the kangaroo apple as well. Now, I sort of divide this group mentally into two. There are some that just have quite dry seeds already. And by that, I'm talking about the capsicums and the chilies. And I remember there was someone wanting to know specifically how we save chili seed in here. So here we go. And for capsicums and chilies, it really is simple. You just need to make sure that the chili or capsicum that you pick for seed has fully matured. And so that means not a green capsicum or chili usually, because the green is actually young. And of course, capsicums and chilies tend to turn colours like red or yellow or sometimes purple or even white when they mature. In the photograph you can see here, I want you to just hone in on the wrinkles on the capsicum. And as is the case with a few of these groups, the stage that we would pick them for seed ideally is a bit past the point where we want to pick them for the kitchen. And again, with this family, what that can look like is a bit of a wrinkled skin. And that's telling me that the plant has put as much energy as possible into those seeds and it's starting to give up, and it won't be able to put much more in. So we can safely pick it for seed. So in this case, once it gets to that mature stage, we can simply scrape those seeds out, label them, that's very important, and leave them to dry, in this case on a plate. And we don't want to dry seeds in the sun or at a high temperature. So just in the shade at room temperature is perfect, whether that's outdoors or indoors, depending on the best spot for you. And so that's pretty simple, right? That's capsicums and that's chili. Now, other plants in this family have got a more gel-like flesh. I hope you can picture that. We've got tomatoes in that group, and we've got tamarillos, incidentally, if you know what they are, and things like pepinos. And there's two ways that we can save seed from those types. And the first one is quite interesting. This is the official technique, and this involves a bit of fermentation, which is quite interesting. So I've got some photos here of the process for you. If you want to try this, what you can do is scoop out the flesh of the tomatoes, or honestly, sometimes I just leave them in the tomato and let the tomato rot a little bit. But in this case, you can see a bowl here with a layer of white mold that's grown on the surface. And don't be horrified, because that's actually part of the process. What I've done on the right-hand side is, after that mold has gone through, I've then rubbed the seeds in a sieve under running water to clean them up, and then let them dry. And the reason why you might do that is because it cleans off a lot of that gel structure around the seed. And with it, it can actually remove some potential diseases that might be able to be transferred through to the next generation of plants. So when you buy tomato seeds from a commercial source, they will have gone through this process, and that's why they're so clean. You can even see the individual hairs on the tomatoes. So feel free to have a go at that at home if you'd like to. And a question from Meg, how long do you have to leave the tomato seeds in the water? Well, there's actually not necessarily water there, Meg, although I think sometimes people add it. It's just the juice of the tomato that they're sitting in. And it may vary depending on room temperature for you, But the best sign is when it's obviously rotted and when you start to see some sort of mold appearing on the surface. It can get pretty funky and smell as well. Really, yeah, you can do it once you start to see those signs of fermentation, and you'll know that you haven't done it long enough if you still can't get the gel off the seeds when you rub them under running water. So mine usually sit on my desk for about a week, and then the smell reminds me to deal with them, and that's the process that I use. Now, for people who don't like the idea of smelly, rotten tomato seed lying around your house for a week, which is completely fair enough, the other tried and tested way of saving tomato seeds is the way that my mum taught me. Thanks, Mum. And that's actually to just smash the contents of your tomato fresh onto a piece of kitchen paper and or some kind of paper, and just let them dry, again at room temperature, somewhere in the shade. And when they're dry, you can actually write the variety name on the paper, which is so convenient. And when you want to grow these tomatoes, what you'll do is actually rip off a piece of paper with a seed on it, and you'll plant that. And of course, the paper will just break down and biodegrade back into food for your tomato plant. So it's a lovely technique. I have been told that you might not have seed that lasts as long just because you haven't cleaned it as thoroughly. But certainly if you're saving seeds every year or two from a home tomato crop, this is a really good method and a lovely one to cut into pieces and share with other gardeners as well. Okay, I'm going to move on now to another family, which is the Amaranthacea family, or the beet family. And this includes favourites like amaranth and silver beet and rainbow chard and some perpetual spinach, beetroot, spinach, and even quinoa. And these plants look a little bit wild and crazy when they go to seed. They really shoot up high. And I wanted to show you what the seeds look like at different stages of development. So I've got some contrasts here, and the top one are seeds that really aren't formed yet. They look like they might be on the way, and you may be tempted to try and pick them. What we're looking for is the ones on the bottom here, which have really started to fill out, and they feel hard when you squeeze them between your finger and thumb. And you can also see that the stem has started to go a bit yellow, which again is a cue that that mother plant is starting to die off and it's not putting any more energy and resources into the seeds. So it would be safe to pull the plant up at this time and to grab those seeds from it. With silver beet and beet seeds, and actually possibly some other plants in this family as well, just a little fun fact here is these seeds are actually corky packages that contain the seed. So you will actually get multiple plants popping up if you plant one of these so-called seeds, because they're actually a little composite package. So that's this family. I'll show you a couple of methods for the process of removing them and cleaning them up that apply to some other families as well. Oh, right now is when I'm going to do that. So I made a little video just to show you how I remove some of the chaff from the seed. And the chaff is all the stuff that's not the seed. So all of the bits of plant or the pods sometimes that the seed is packaged in. And again, while some people do store seed with the chaff, you run the risk of carrying over some pests and diseases, and it can also take up a lot more room in your seed box. So it is helpful to have a couple of tricks to clean it up. And I almost don't need a video for this. I know sometimes videos are a bit choppy in Zoom, so I'll speed through. And I find with seed saving, it's quite helpful to have a range of different sieve gauges, and many people will have them already in the kitchen. So it's a nice way to use them in a different context. So sometimes you'll sieve and you'll have the seeds dropping through, like in this case. Sometimes you'll sieve and the chaff will fall through. So just try and pick up some different gauges of sieves from op shops and things if you don't have them already, and it'll give you lots of options for different types of seed. Now at the very end, I do a bit of a trick, and I'll show you later a proper version. So it's just a little bit of breath there to clean off the last dust. And you can see how beautiful and clean that amaranth seed is in the bowl. And I'll show you a bit more depth on how to do winnowing later on. Ross, I can see your question about seed boxes. I'm going to come to that at the end, so maybe hold on to that one for now and let me know if it doesn't get covered later. All right, the next family we'll go through is the Apiaceae family, the carrot family, and also called the umbels. And there's lots of common vegetables in this group: carrots, parsnips, parsley, fennel, dill, coriander, celery. Some common weeds like Queen Anne's lace, which are actually quite helpful for bringing in beneficial plants. So lots of different common plants in this family. And you can usually pick up which family these plants are from by looking at the shape of the flowers, because they all have these quite delicate and beautiful umbrella-shaped flower heads. And with this family, you'll see those flowers, and once again, the trick is just knowing when do I pick them, when are the seeds ready. So I've got a little succession here for you, and we've got the parsley flowers that are only flowers on the left. We've got the parsley that's formed some seed and is probably at the point where I can just pick it, because you can see that the seed is quite rounded. If I squeezed it between my thumb and finger, I would feel the seeds. You can feel they've become hard, and see the stem is yellowing as well, which is another indication that the mother plant is finished. And finally, I've got some very dry here, dill seeds as well, which follow the same pattern. And this family often has darker seed. So again, if you see the seeds change colour and really start to dry out, that can be a great indicator for you as well. So the only trick with this family is just picking them when they're fully mature, and you can use either the sieving technique or the winnowing technique that I'm going to show you next to clean them up. Another family with, yes, again, similar thing is the Asteraceae, or the lettuce family, the aster family, or daisies. And this family includes common vegetables like lettuce and endive and chicory and sunflower. And it also includes our native yam daisy, or murnong, Microceras lanceolata, which is a staple food plant from our Indigenous foods around these parts. And that's the photograph of the flower in the centre there. And if you're thinking it looks like a dandelion, you'd be right. In growth as well, it looks like a dandelion. And they're actually in the same family, and look quite similar as well. They have similar seeds. So you can use this technique for them. And this family often produce little clusters of seeds with a fluffy top. And I've got a picture here of lettuce seed that's fully dry. And once again, I'll just be squeezing the flowers. Once they start to look like this, I'll squeeze them between my fingers and make sure they feel like they're fleshed out or filled out, and they feel hard, and then I should be good to go to save them. Marigolds are in this family, and they're like a giant version. And for some seeds, it is as simple as just picking off the dried seed head and taking them out. And just to demonstrate that, I thought I'd open a few marigold seed heads for you. And there are the seeds. So that one's super simple. Okay, we've got the onion family with the globe that was mentioned before. And once again, similar pattern in this family, but here's an example of what they can look like. Usually black seeds, and they start to explode out of that purple globe, or sometimes white globe, and they end up looking like this. And that's the stage that I would be grabbing them for seed. All right, now we're going to move on to a slightly more complicated family, and that is the Brassica family, or the Brassicaceae, or the broccoli family. And this contains lots of very common vegetables, particularly in the winter months for us here in Melbourne. And what is endlessly incredible for me is that so many of these common vegetables are actually the same species. Brassica oleracea, which is a common brassica weed, or also known as wild mustard, or a few other names as well. So have a look at this diagram here. And again, just looping back to what I was saying about tomatoes having been bred out for lots of different flavours and colours and sizes, in this particular instance, we've got people who have selected for the stem and created kohlrabi, people who selected for the flower bud clusters, and we've got cauliflower, people who selected for little side shoots or lateral buds, and we've got Brussels sprouts, and so on and so on. So this is really quite phenomenal. We've created all these different flavors and vegetables and growth habits from one species. But as you're probably picking up, this is also slightly problematic when you come to save seeds, because all of these different vegetables can cross with each other in the next generation. And you can end up, for example, with crosses between the two. So you might have a Brussels sprout cauliflower, a broccoli with kale-like leaves, and so on. And there's so much outbreeding going on here that we've got new varieties popping up, like we've got Brussels sprouts combined with kale to produce little kale sprouts, which I've seen recently. And we've got cauliflower that's been turned into a sprouting cauliflower, like sprouting broccoli, that's popping up now. So huge excitement in there. But if you want perfect cabbages that are the same as the cabbages you've always grown, then you need to control pollination from this whole range of vegetables in your garden, plus the wild mustard weed that's probably growing around the corner as well. And in this family, they are outbreeding, and the recommendation is that you should have at least 20 of one of these plants flowering at the same time if you want to maintain that genetic diversity that we were talking about before. So once again, I don't want this to put you off at all. And I, all the time, I save seed from plants in this family and I grow them and I have pretty good results. But I want you to understand, if you get some seed that's been just collected without any controlling of pollination, and you start getting weaker plants or strange crosses, this is what's going on underneath all of that. So just keep that in mind. And if you just want exactly the same vegetables without any mutations, then this is a family that we can go back to those fantastic local heirloom seed companies and support them by buying seed from them. All right, so now we're moving on to the other technique for removing chaff from seed that you can use with any dry seed. This is called winnowing, and I've got a photograph of my friend Grace here helping me with some brassica seed. And what I'll do is usually these bunches, when I cut them out of the garden, they'll be half dry. Sometimes they need a bit more drying, so I'll tie them up in a bunch and just hang them up in the shade somewhere, nice and kind of cool temperature. And when they fully dried after a couple of weeks and the chaff is shattering and maybe some pods are breaking open, I know that they're ready for this step. So what I'll be doing is grabbing that bunch, and if you can see my video, I'll just be running my fingers down it to try and break off the seed and the chaff into a bowl. In this case, there was so much that Grace forgot about the bowl and just did it on a sheet, and you can tip the sheet into the bowl, and that way you don't lose as much over the edge. And then once you've got your collection in the bowl, then you can use this gorgeous technique called winnowing, and I've got another video here to show you that process. It's just a short video. I'll play it one more time. I do hope you'll get a chance to try this, because it is actually quite a beautiful thing to do. I always feel like I'm doing something that our ancestors would have done a lot of when I do this winnowing process. So to explain it to you, what I'm doing is shaking the bowl a lot, and that helps the seed, which is heavier, to sink down to the bottom. And if you notice, I'm tilting the bowl slightly away from me to get the right angle, and I'm blowing in a bit of a U shape around the edges of the bowl. And so you'll work this out. If you give it a go, you work this all out very quickly. You will lose a little bit of seed doing this, but actually that's a good thing, because the seed that you'll blow off is usually the lighter seed, And the lightest seed is usually the smallest and the weakest seed. And so you're actually doing a bit of selection just through this process of winnowing, and hopefully you'll end up with a slightly stronger batch of plants as a result. So that's winnowing, and you can use that for any seed that's dry that has enough of a weight difference so that you're not accidentally blowing away all of the seed. Now, let's have a look at some other families now. And for this one, we'll go to the Cucurbitaceae family, which is the pumpkin family and sometimes called cucurbits. And you probably recognize all the crops here: the pumpkins, cucumbers, zucchini, squash, and watermelon as well. And I'm just noticing there are a few questions, but they're not exactly on this topic. So if it's all right, we'll leave them to the end, and I'm happy to come back to those as well. So in this family, once again, we have this situation where when you're picking for the kitchen, you're actually picking some quite immature vegetables. So I'd like you to picture what a zucchini looks like when you pick it to eat. And then have a think about what a mature zucchini would look like. And if you're unsure, I'll give you a hint. They look a lot more like this. This is a tromboncino zucchini, which is actually sort of a type of pumpkin, really. But I pick them for the kitchen like the small ones in my basket, and I pick them for seed when they're this large, swollen, orange, almost gourd. And this is the reason, just a little fun fact on the side, why if you have something from this family popping up in your compost pile, it's almost always a pumpkin, because there actually aren't many plants in this family that we eat when they're fully mature. But the pumpkins we do, so they tend to have viable seed, and that's the seed that's going to come up in your compost. So for this family, the first most important thing is to make sure that you pick something that's mature, that has fully viable seed. And I've also read from a plant breeder that in this family, the seeds keep maturing for about 20 days after you've harvested the fruit or the pumpkin or the crop. So in other words, if you are saving them for seed, you might want to store them for a month before you dig out the seeds, just to make sure that they've got all of that nourishment embedded in that seed. Now, remember when we were talking about controlling pollination, and if you want to do this and avoid having a scramble of different pumpkins mix in to create a new pumpkin variety, which incidentally can be great. So it's another reason I don't want to put you off this, because this is how so many of our varieties have evolved through these random mutations and crosses that have happened in home gardens and on farms. But if you don't want that, and if you want to make sure that you keep growing butternuts year after year, what you can do is do this taping of flowers, which is actually quite easy to achieve for pumpkins and zucchinis on a home garden scale. And this involves recognizing what a male and female flower looks like, and actually avoiding an insect from getting in there before you, and taking that pollen and moving it around. So what you're going to do is you're going to go out the day before you want to do this, and you'll look for male and female flowers that haven't opened but are about to open the next day. And I'll show you what they look like in a minute. And what you'll do is tape up the flowers, as you can see here, so they can't open without you being there. And that's so important, because if a bee gets up before you've had your morning breakfast and tea or coffee or other routine, and they get out there, then the whole thing is wasted. So we're going to tightly close them and make sure nothing gets in before us. And then when you're ready, you will go outside and cut off the male flower, or if you like, you can take a paintbrush and you can swirl it around and grab some of that pollen. And then you'll find your female flower and you open up the tape very gently, and you will dab in that male part of the male flower, and or you'll get your paintbrush and swirl it around in there, and then you'll tape up that flower shut again until it drops off in a day or two. And by doing that, you're making sure that only pollen from this chosen variety pollinates that flower. So the seed will certainly be pure from this pumpkin. And of course, you need to mark this pumpkin with a little flag or a ribbon or something to make sure that you know which pumpkin to come back to and save seed from. So the Male and female flowers are shown in the top left here, and all flowers in this family have this pattern where the males are on this long stem and the females have a little immature fruit. We call it a fruit because it sort of is a fruit technically, even though we eat them as a vegetable. So they have a little immature version here and a thicker stem. And the insides of the flowers also look different as well. And for those who were asking earlier, I took this photograph of my zucchini earlier this season, and I took it because it actually has so much going on here. So you may not be as interested in this as I am, but I'm going to walk you through what all these things are one by one. So see if you can spot the male and female flowers and see if you can spot what's going on with some of the fruits here. So the male flowers, I'm going to highlight them for you with my mouse. We've got one of them over here. This one looks like it is going to open tomorrow because I can see it's fully formed. It's got the yellow petal colour and I know from experience that one will open tomorrow. What I'm contrasting it with is this male over here where I think it already has opened because see the top has started to come apart, so it's actually open and then not fully closed again. And this one here is definitely open today and then it's closed up again because it's all floppy. So that's the spectrum of male flowers, and you can also have a look at the stems, which are quite long and tall. The female flowers, we've got one of them here, and this one has just opened probably today or perhaps yesterday because I can see the flower has opened. It would have looked like this one, and now it's sort of floppy and not fully closed. We also have female flowers, this one here and this little baby one here, that are on the way, but they're not going to open tomorrow because there's no yellowing and they're too small. Now what's happened here, we've got a fruit here and this one looks like it has been pollinated because it is starting to grow and it's looking even and it's looking just normal. This fruit over here has only just had its flower open, so we can't tell yet whether pollination has been successful. And this fruit down here has gone terribly wrong. It started to go yellow and rot at the flower end. And even though it's sort of grown a little bit, it's not growing evenly. And this is what zucchini flowers and other flowers in this family look like when they don't get pollinated. So this is about to rot and drop off. So if you've got a lot of these in your garden, you need some more insects, or you need to grab a little paintbrush and pretend to be one and make sure that that pollination is actually happening. Now I can see a question from Alice. If saving seed from a cucurbit early or mid-season, does allowing a fruit to reach maturity affect the length of time that the plant will fruit? Oh, that's an excellent question, Alice. Thank you for asking that. So this is a thing with some vegetables. If you allow them to mature a fruit through to this stage early in the season or mid-season, sometimes they don't produce as much other young fruit, and that can be a problem if we want to also eat that. Now, Alice, I'm not actually 100% sure if that happens for this family, but that's certainly an effect that I worry about. So in the case of this family or other plants, you might want to make sure you've got other ones that you can eat from, because it can slow down the amount of food that they can produce. So it's a really good question. I'm sorry I don't have a specific answer for this family for you. Now, for plants that have seed in a wet flesh, and that includes the tomatoes that we were fermenting earlier, I'm going to show you the wet cleaning method, which is fairly straightforward, and I will speed through this video a little bit so you don't get too bored, and I'll just show you how I save seed from pumpkins. So we're scooping it out, and here I'm just trying to pull off by hand as much of that chunky flesh as I can. There are limits to this. So the next step after this is I start to wash them. Now, having made a big fuss over getting seeds dry, a lot of people go, oh, but you're wetting them, what's going to happen? Are they going to sprout? And luckily, if the seeds are already in wet flesh, the water at this stage is not too big a problem, but we are going to make sure we dry them thoroughly after this step. So you can see here, I'm just sort of moving them around the bowl and picking some larger bits off. And then the next step is I'm going to rub them on a sieve and use some of that abrasion of the sieve to get the last little bits of that flesh off. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I do this once or twice to just get them as clean as I can. And then once you're happy with them, you can shake them off. And what I do, this is, no one taught me this, I just sort of developed it over time. I'll spread them around the sieve, because sieves are actually quite lovely, very aerated environments for seeds to dry in. So I just break them up a little bit by spreading them around the sieve, so they've all got as much airflow as possible. And then I actually leave them in sieves to dry. But if you wanted to, you could spread them out on a plate or something else as well. And as they're drying, I would often just move them around a bit with my fingers to break up any that are stuck together and make sure that they're getting dried evenly. And they'll stay in there labelled on my desk for a couple of weeks until they're definitely fully dry and they can go into storage. All right, and I think the final family I've got for you tonight is the Poaceae family, which is the corn family or the grass family. And it includes corn and maize. And I should also update this to include lots of our native grasses as well, and many of which are food plants. So you can use that on them as well. And we've already talked about how this family are wind pollinated. And the classic gardener's advice when you're planting corn is to make sure that you plant them in a block rather than in a line, because we need the pollination to be swirled around within the block to have good results. And what I think is just incredible about this family, or about corn specifically in this family, is that each of these corn kernels is tied to one of those silky threads that you see poking out of the top of your corn cobs. So what we need to happen for a good full cob of corn is we need the pollen to drop from the tops of the plant here up at the flowers. We need a single grain of pollen to lodge on every single one of those beautiful corn silky fibres, and that will make sure that a grain of corn forms at the very base inside our cob. So what can happen if you don't have a large enough patch, or if you plant them in a line and the wind just whisks away that pollen without touching another plant, is you end up with a rather miserable, pathetic little cob like the one that you can see here. So that's why corn is often easier to grow in a larger block. But you can hand pollinate this if you're diligent in a home garden, if you think it's worth it. And of course, I do love the flavours of fresh homegrown corn, so it may be worth it for many of you out there. But just know that it does require that bit of extra effort if you can't plant a large clump. And corn, as I mentioned before, unfortunately is one of those extensively outbreeding varieties. So if you were saving your own seed from corn, be especially aware that you might have some problems with vigour and with genetic diversity if you do that for a longer time. And Stars actually said, I grew some blue gem corn this year and the kernels look perfect, but they're all white instead of amazing rainbow blue colours. That's interesting, Star, and we can't say for sure if that's a genetic diversity issue because they've changed colour rather than all gone the blue colour. But yeah, that is the sort of thing that we might expect to happen if it wasn't being saved from a large pool. Susan said a large crop of corn. What is a large crop of corn? So again, that advice for corn, depending on what book you read, so there is a little bit of debate out there. It's somewhere from 50 to 200 plants to maintain that full genetic diversity of what corn is capable of. So yeah, it is a little bit beyond the reach of most small urban gardens, but you know, get together with your neighbours, and if you don't have too many windbreaks and hedges between your gardens, maybe you can pull that off. If not, just go for it anyway. You can do some hand pollination and just keep an eye on the strength of your seed if you're saving it year after year. Now, if you want to save the seed from corn, it is simple once you've grown it. All you need to do is pull back the leaf, or I shouldn't call them leaves, but strip that cover back from the corn cob, and you can actually use that to tie them up to, say, like a curtain rail or some kind of hanging point. Here I've got them pegged up above my desk, and they're quite ornamental and beautiful, and I do think we should enjoy all of the beautiful and aesthetic parts of seed saving as much as possible as well. So all you need to do is just hang them up somewhere to dry like this, and once they are dry, if you don't want to enjoy them in this way, you can scrape those kernels off and put them into storage. Okie doke, so that completes the common vegetable family. So I hope that you've picked up a couple of things in there that you can try this season. But we're not done yet, of course, because we need to talk about how to store our seed to keep it alive and to make sure that it stays viable for as long as possible. And the mantra that I'd like you to remember is cool, dark, and dry, CDD. And those are really the most ideal conditions for seeds so that they can stay alive for as long as possible. By cool, I mean like ideally a little bit cooler than room temperature, like 20 degrees, but at least at a normal house temperature, not out in your greenhouse or in your garden shed where it could be going well beyond that temperature when it heats up in the middle of summer. As I said, some people will choose to store their seeds in the freezer, and that's good if you've got enough freezer space, and will extend the viability of your seeds substantially. Myself, I'm often rummaging around in my seed box for teaching, so it does tend to be in a sort of a living area in my house. But if I wasn't grabbing things from it all the time, the best spot at my house is actually under a bed in one of the rooms on the southern side of the house that doesn't tend to heat up as much. So we want like a nice stable temperature as well, not too many fluctuations. And hopefully you can go through your home and just think about where those sorts of spots might be. Of course, we'd like it to be dark as well, because UV light can start to affect seeds, so we don't want them out in the sun at all. And dry is also important. So if you had somewhere cool, but it also happens to be quite humid and moist, that wouldn't be very good. So I can't tell you where's the best spot, but that's the list of things that we'd be looking for. To help with keeping them dry, you can also reuse some of the desiccant packs from commercial products, some food products, and sometimes even, I think, shoes sometimes come with these. They're great. It's good to keep them out of landfill, but just know that they do need to be refreshed. So usually every winter I'll take them out and I'll leave them somewhere not on top of, but close to our little wood heater, that little box that we've got here, and they'll dry out overnight, and then they can go back in the seed box for another year the next day. And I know that because one of mine is actually colour change, and I can see it has changed from blue to pink over the course of a year, and I know that it's definitely needing to be dried out to stay effective. So they're a little handy one that you can use. I wouldn't recommend putting rice in your seed box, which is sort of developed a reputation as being something to absorb moisture, because rice is a really valuable food for lots of pests, and it can encourage them to get into your seed box as well. So this is what I do, and I think they're a good thing. If you can't find any desiccant packages, then you don't need them. Don't worry about them. Yeah, this is my seed box on the left here, and I put in some cardboard dividers, so I've got a very organised box with some alphabetical ordering so I can find everything. And you'll see I've got a mix of some commercial seed packs, I've got some recycled Ziploc plastic bags, and I've got some recycled little food containers. I've also got some paper bags in there, so they're fine as well. And if you want to, you can use glass jars. but they just don't fit easily into a small space. So it doesn't really seem to matter what type of packaging you've got, as long as you get the cool, dry and dry conditions right. And what I would pay a bit of attention to is making sure that you are sealed as much as possible against pests. And in this part of the world, there seems to be two that you need to worry about. One of them is the bean weevil beetle, and just generally weevil beetles. And that we were talking about freezing your seeds before during the bean section, the bean family. And here's what happens if you don't do that. You get partway through autumn or winter and you start seeing things hatching out of your bean seeds. So if you see these little holes emerging, then that's what's going on. And that freezing trick is the way to combat that next year. And I don't know if these seeds would still be viable. They might still grow, but they're probably going to be a bit weak because they've lost some of the food store for the little seed. And the other one is the grain moths, which of course wreak havoc in our pantries. So keeping them out of your pantry by freezing things coming in can also help to protect your seed box as well. But of course, keeping your seeds tucked away in a really tightly sealed container will help with both. So that is also an important consideration for you. Some people put in strongly smelling dried herbs like wormwood, for example, and people talk about putting dried lavender in there. So you could also try those, but I wouldn't rely on them to keep these pests out. The little good extra tip maybe for the back pocket. All right, and then we come on to the sharing of the seed, and I didn't want to leave you without encouraging a couple of different avenues that go a bit beyond sharing with your neighbours over the fence, although of course that is also a wonderful thing to do. We are having a bit of an explosion of seed libraries in Melbourne and Victoria at the moment, which I just think is fabulous, and often supported by local councils and community groups. The key to seed libraries, though, is if all the seeds leave the library and very few seeds come back, then these sorts of projects will often fall over and not be replenished. So I strongly encourage you to find your local seed library. And you heard Ellie talk about the ones that are being set up in Banyule and Nillumbik soon. So find them and make sure you patronise them and also return some seeds to them as well. Here's a lovely example of one in Castlemaine at their library. And I also wanted to give a shout out just generally to Seed Savers groups. And there is a website, seedsavers.net, and you can see if you can find a local group on there. And if there isn't one, then they're really easy to start. You just need to declare a time and a date and have a table out. And it's just so much fun to swap and share varieties with other gardeners. And in the Blue Mountains, the Seed Savers group there have got another little nifty add-on. And on the photo on the right, you can see they've got a box. And this is set up in a little co-op grocery store. And they actually have a bunch of their seed packets in the store for sale for about $1 a packet. So they've got a real advantage over the commercial seeds. And some information about the group and how to connect with them, which I just thought was a lovely idea to try and reach a few more people and get the word out. The other thing I'd really love to encourage you to take away from tonight is that we can all just pick one variety of seed and stand by it. And for me personally, I've decided the rattlesnake green bean is my variety. I'm holding up to the camera, you probably can't see, but this is my variety that I personally will take responsibility for and make sure that it reaches the next generation of gardeners and farmers. So every year I make a special effort to ensure that I've got enough rattlesnake seeds to share freely with anyone who I come across. And I love to do that. And I'm sorry that we're not in the same room tonight. Otherwise you would all have a little handful of rattlesnake beans. But my friend Peeway has just taken it to the next level. And I've put a little snapshot of her seeds, the glass gem corn, and the little packet and the letter that goes along with them when she hands them out. And I intend to copy this one day soon, where you actually tell the story about the seeds and give some more information on them and how to grow them. And Peeway has even set up a Facebook group where people can share their stories of growing glass gem corn and share recipes. And so I think it's just a beautiful idea. But even if you don't want to go that far, I just encourage all of us to pick one variety and stand by it, because it will only take that much to make sure that this huge range of seeds gets to the next generation safely. So I invite you to think about which variety or varieties you might like to stand by as well. And Joanne says she has rattlesnake beans growing now that I got from a member of our community garden at a seedling and seed swap. Well, that's fantastic, Joanne. And you can also stand by rattlesnake beans. Beautiful. Okay, so coming right to the end now. And what I've tried to do tonight is give you a solid introduction. But of course, there's a lot more to learn, and there's a lot more plant families out there, each with different requirements. So if you would like to learn a little bit more, then I heartily recommend these resources to you. The Seed Savers Handbook from Michelle and Jude Fanton is an Australian classic. They started the Seed Savers Network in Australia, and they're legends in the scene. And I do recommend their book. I also wanted to mention to you that Seed to Seed by Suzanne Ashworth is written for North American gardeners, but actually does have a bit more detail than the Seed Savers Handbook, and both on techniques and also lots more varieties as well. So this book tends to be my go-to reference if I need technical detail on a more unusual vegetable. And then if tonight has sparked something within you, like it sparked within me, I do recommend the book on the right-hand side. The author's name, I'm still not sure if I pronounced right, but Carol Deep or Deppy. And this book on breeding your own vegetable varieties goes into some depth on the genetics of saving seeds and the sorts of processes and techniques that you can use to do backyard breeding or breeding at a small farm scale, if that's what you'd like to do as well. So there you go. That brings us to the end of the official content. So I want to say thanks again to Nilambik and Daniel for having me. I have a very neglected Instagram page that I hope to get back on soon, but if you do want to connect with me on there, I'll catch up to you soon, and feel free to tag in all the photographs of your seed saving efforts. And I also want to now just open up for questions and see if there's anything that we might have missed, anything that is still unclear that I can clarify for you before we finish. So at this point, if you did want to duck out, have a wonderful evening and best of luck with saving seeds out there this year. And if you would like to pop any remaining questions back in the bottom of the chat window to let me know you're still here and keen, then now's a great time to do that. And I promise I'll stay until we've cleared them all up. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a good evening. And I hope to catch you out there in person at a face-to-face event sometime soon. And I think Steph and Ellie have had to go to other meetings. So I'll try and manage the questions myself now. And I can see one from Meg saying, because some plants take a long time to grow seeds, do you plan your garden around seed savings at all? Yes, Meg, so another great question. And I should have said, Ashley, that in a small garden like mine is very small. I guess not if you're in a unit or balcony, but it's difficult when you've got a small urban garden to grow things out to the full life cycle in order to collect seed. So I don't necessarily save seed for every single vegetable that I grow. I save the ones that I can get within the time frame of my tight planting plan. So I plan my garden around seed saving to the extent that I know which ones I'm saving seed from. And that tends to be things like tomato and bean family, and the Apiaceae and Asteraceae families, the lettuce and the sort of parsley families. But I'm not planning around things like brassicas or plants that take a long season, like pumpkins sometimes as well, because I don't have the space for them. So you can choose to do that, or you can do what's easy and support some really excellent local seed companies as well. Now, bear with me. I'm going to try and find the questions. Thank you for all your kind messages as well. Sylvia has said, I just want to ask if it's okay to store seeds in the fridge. So people definitely do that, Sylvia. Keep in mind though that it needs to stay dry, and fridges often can have a lot of moisture in them, and that moisture would be a problem if it got into your seed box. So the freezer in some ways is a bit less risky than that. And yeah, that's why I sort of tend to encourage the freezer rather than the fridge. But yes, I have met people who keep seeds in the fridge. So good luck if you do that. Let me know how you go. And
sorry.
Hi.
Hi, there was a question about broad beans and rust.
What was the question specifically, Faye?
Wendy asked earlier on her broad beans that have rust, can she save the seeds if they've got rust?
Oh, thanks, Faye, for reminding me. Yeah, look, there'll always be a bit of a risk there. If there's a disease that you can see, you might end up with some, for example, some fungal spores on that seed, and then it might exacerbate it next year. So I can't say that that's without risk. I do find though that if you've got rust or you've got another disease, it's probably around your garden anyway. And as long as the seed looks healthy and strong, personally, I'd probably give it a go. But yeah, that is something to consider. If it doesn't look healthy, then you are introducing that possibility that it might continue that way next year. Yeah. Thanks, Faye. Was there any other one that I missed from earlier in the session? Otherwise, I'll just keep moving down this.
Yeah, I think there was. I'll go back up in a minute. But there was one from Michelle saying, is it okay just to let the seed drop and germinate when it wants?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually something I should add to the session as well. There's lots of awesome questions tonight. Yeah, absolutely. That's totally legitimate, Michelle. It's slightly more risky because you just never know whether the seed might be taken by a critter, whether it might germinate and fail, if it pops up at the wrong time of year and the climate's not quite ready. So if it's a very precious variety, then I'd probably gather seed and keep it somewhere safe. If you've got a lot of it and you just want to make it easy for yourself and just see what pops up, it's absolutely legitimate and a good, effective technique. And people talk about it as developing a seed bank in your soil. So your soil is actually going to start growing all the things that you want if you allow it to do that over time. Yeah, so great point. Really legit and wonderful technique.
There was a question about growing broccoli seed. This is from earlier on. Kath asked about when's she saved some of her own broccoli seed from last year, and she just wondered when's the best time to start planting it.
Sure, you could start putting it in now. Broccoli can grow at most times of the year. We just usually avoid the middle of summer when it's quite hot. I personally don't bother to grow the brassica family except for some rocket through the warmer months because I find the pressure of the cabbage white butterfly just too intense, and I just can't be bothered putting nets on or hand picking them off when they go through so many life cycles at that time of year. So I'll actually be starting broccoli seeds soon and getting them in so that they're mature by the time the really cold weather hits, so that I can start eating them in winter. So now is actually the time when I'll be putting them in, but you could do that for most of the year if you wanted to.
Someone gave some nice feedback about your zucchini picture. She said, brilliant webinar, finally can read zucchini flowers.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Right. And I find it personally quite fun being like a zucchini plant interpreter. I hope it clears up some mysteries out there. I'm not seeing too many other. Thank you for all the lovely feedback. I really appreciate that. I don't know if an evaluation form is coming. I presume it might be, so you can capture that for the council. But I'm not actually seeing any more questions, which tells me we might be done. So here's a last chance if there are any out there left over.
And were you still planning to send some information through for the Local Food Connect website?
Yeah, that's right. The notes that I sent through, Faye, can go. So I'll send them through to council and to yourself as well.
Yeah.
You do that tonight, in fact. So you'll have those. And a couple of people said they might have had trouble downloading them, and make sure that they get a copy as a follow-up as well. I don't think there's going to be professional consequences.
So Kat, it's Richard here. So yeah, hey Faye. Thank you very much, Kat, for doing this presentation. Sorry I've missed the first part of it. But there was a question there that is the recording going to be available? So the plan is that we will be making available the recording. So we just need to work through the logistics of that. So hopefully, probably sometime next week, we'll be sending out an email to let you know that the recording's there. So I just, if there may be still some more questions, but I'd just like to say again, thank you to Kat for supporting this home harvest webinar. It's also a part of the Seed Library program, which is coming to a library or a venue close to you in Nillumbik and Banyule. And so I'm here representing Nillumbik today, but also I'd like to thank Banyule and Ellie for the work she did in supporting the activities, and also Local Food Connect. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Richard. Such a pleasure to ramble on about your favourite subjects with a group.
It is. I know I do that every night at the moment.
Yeah, lovely. So I'll get onto that recording and things. I'll try and send them through tomorrow. And other than that, I think we might be done. So yeah, good luck out there. And I guess I'll close the meeting.
Thanks, Kat.
Everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Good night.